Some places change you, not because they're magical or mysterious, but because they test what you're made of. Willow Shore was that place for me, a quiet lake town, generations deep, where the water reflects more than just sky. It reflects who you are when no one's looking. My family built a life here, modest, steady, proud. And for decades, that cabin on the ridge stood untouched. But peace doesn't always come easy, especially when outsiders arrive thinking money buys everything, including your land. What started as a simple property dispute turned into something bigger, a battle not just for space, but for respect, for community, and for legacy. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes standing your ground is the most neighborly thing you can do. Jackson Price had always imagined retiring in peace. After 40 years as a real estate attorney in Tampa, he'd had his fill of boardroom brawls, shady easements, and neighborly squabbles that somehow escalated into lawsuits. He didn't want much, just still mornings, a view of the water, and a dock sturdy enough for fishing. That's why he returned to Pineglass Lake, nestled between rolling pines and the soft hush of waves. The cabin his grandfather built in 1947 still stood, updated, with modest comforts but untouched in spirit. It wasn't fancy. A single-story structure, pine paneling inside and out, a hand-carved porch swing, and a screened-in sunroom. Simple. Private. His. For 15 years, Jackson had made regular visits, caring for the property like it was part of him. He knew every root that crept through the stone path, every loose board on the dock. The place was his sanctuary, a living memory of generations before him. One day, it would be his full-time home, until the Monroes arrived. It started with a rumor. A city couple, big money, big plans, had bought the lot next door, the old Brenshaw place. The Brenshaws were kind, soft-spoken retirees who once left a tin of cookies on Jackson's doorstep every Christmas. When they moved to be closer to family, he was sad to see them go. But he never expected their replacements to bulldoze that quiet legacy in less than a season. The Monroes didn't just renovate, they demolished. Within 3 months, the charming lake house was replaced by a slate-gray, modern monolith with sharp angles and glass railings that screamed magazine spread. Their driveway sparkled under custom-installed LED pavers. Their boat was bigger than some people's homes, and their detached garage, it bled into Jackson's land. He saw it the moment he pulled up that warm April morning, a hulking concrete foundation, wood frames rising like bones. Jackson cut the engine and climbed out of his truck, blinking against the sun. His boots crunched the gravel as he walked the line. And there it was, the unmistakable edge of poured concrete, jutting a full 10 feet, past the boundary marked on the survey he'd had certified when his father passed the cabin to him. It wasn't a mistake. It was trespass. Jackson stood still for a moment, the air thick with pollen and disbelief. Then, he pulled out his phone and started snapping pictures. Foundation markers, rebar, the lot stake he had personally hammered into the ground years ago, now buried under the edge of someone else's dream garage. That was when the SUV rolled in, jet black, gleaming. A woman in oversized sunglasses and a white linen jumpsuit stepped out, barely glancing at Jackson. "Can I help you?" she asked, arms crossed. "I think you already did," Jackson replied, cool and measured. "I'm Jackson Price. I own the property next door." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, right, the cabin." She said it like it was a shed. "Yes, and the garage you're building is on my land." She gave a quick, flat laugh. "It's just a strip of dirt. Besides, the Brenshaws told us we could use it." "Verbal agreements don't override legal property lines," Jackson said, "and I have the official survey on file with the county." Her smile thinned. "Well, my husband handles that stuff. Maybe talk to him when he's back, but construction's not stopping." Then she turned her back and walked toward her palace. Jackson stood there a moment longer, pulse low and steady, the way it used to beat before a deposition. He was too old to yell, too smart to bluff, but something told him this wouldn't be settled over coffee and conversation. This was going to be a war, and he had just found the front line. By the time Jackson returned to Tampa Sunday evening, his mind was already building a case. He wasn't looking for a fight, not yet, but he knew that fights had a way of finding people who stood still. And he never stood still for long. On Monday morning, he pulled the full file from his home office, the survey, the deed, the zoning maps, all notarized, all current. He called his old friend Maria Castro at the county records office, who pulled up the permit history for the Monroe's construction. There was no permit for the garage. "They've filed for a renovation on the main house," Maria confirmed over the phone. "Interior work, decking upgrades, and dock extension. Nothing detached, nothing new." Jackson exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Thanks, Maria. Can you send me the formal printout?" "You got it," she said. "You dealing with the Monroes?" "Unfortunately." "I've heard things," she said, tone dropping. "You're not the first neighbor to call." That didn't surprise him. He returned to Pineglass Lake the following weekend. When he arrived, the garage had been fully framed. The roof beams were in place, and on his side of the property line, sawdust littered the grass like confetti from a party he hadn't been invited to. Jackson walked the perimeter, slowly, methodically, taking new photos from every angle. That afternoon, he crossed the lot line and knocked on the Monroe's front door. This time, it was the husband who answered. He was taller than Jackson expected, mid-40s, clean-shaven, wearing a golf polo that looked like it cost more than Jackson's entire outfit. "Mr. Monroe, I'm Jackson Price. I own the land next door." "Yes, my wife mentioned you." His voice was even, rehearsed. "You're the one with the boundary concerns?" "Correct," Jackson said. "We need to talk." They stepped onto the patio, a space that looked more like a luxury hotel lounge than a backyard. Jackson laid out the documentation, showing him the stamped survey, the property markers, the permit files. All crystal clear. Monroe frowned, flipping through the paperwork. "Our contractor told us it was fine," he said finally. "They said the old markers were accurate." "Those markers were off by at least 10 feet, Jackson said. "And even if they weren't, you need written easement permission to build on someone else's land." "Okay, look," Monroe said, holding up a hand. "I understand this is upsetting, but this doesn't have to get ugly. We're all neighbors here." "Then act like one," Jackson replied. "I'm asking, once, that you remove the part of the structure that's on my land. Otherwise, I'll be forced to take legal action." Monroe didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the backyard, where construction equipment was parked along the waterline. "My wife's going to want to talk to her attorney," he said. "We'll get back to you." Jackson nodded once. "You've got a week." He turned and left, walking back to his cabin as the wind rolled off the lake, tugging at the corners of the survey in his hand. He didn't want to escalate this, but if the Monroes were hoping his silence meant surrender, they were about to learn they'd misread their neighbor. Completely. By Wednesday, the garage had walls. Not metaphorical ones, actual, paneled, freshly nailed walls. Jackson stood on his deck sipping lukewarm coffee, watching the hammering echo through the morning air like taunts. They'd clearly received his message, and they'd chosen to ignore it. It was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a declaration. He spent the rest of the day preparing. A second surveyor, independent of the first, confirmed what Jackson already knew. The garage cut nearly 13 feet into his lot. He marked the line with orange flags every 4 feet and installed a temporary rope boundary. He mounted a high-resolution security camera on a pine tree, angled directly at the structure, and he printed 3 copies of a formal cease and desist order, signed by his attorney. The Monroes didn't respond when he left one on their front porch. They didn't acknowledge it when he mailed the second to their home address in Tampa. And they certainly didn't respect the warning stapled to the rope boundary, because on Friday afternoon, the workers returned, not just to continue, but to expand. They poured gravel into what had once been Jackson's side yard, laid conduit for electricity, and stacked sheetrock directly on top of his property. The contractor, a man with a gruff Boston accent and zero interest in small talk, shrugged when Jackson confronted him. "I just build what I'm paid to build," he said. "You got a problem. Take it up with the ones signing my checks." And so he did. That evening, Jackson returned to his law office in Tampa and filed a temporary injunction. His firm, one of the most respected boutique property law practices in the state, pulled every string it needed. And within 48 hours, a judge had granted a stop work order. The court documents were posted by noon Monday, nailed to the garage frame with the grace of a medieval proclamation. They were legally binding and enforceable. Anyone who continued building after notice could face steep penalties. By Tuesday, more lumber had been delivered. They were taunting him now, daring him to escalate. And Jackson, though a patient man, knew when he'd been given no choice. So he made the call. The demolition team arrived before sunrise on Saturday. It was a precision outfit, surgical in their method, with laser levelers and boundary mapping drones. The crew chief, a no-nonsense woman named Lexi, shook Jackson's hand firmly. "You want just what's on your property gone?" she asked. "Exactly," Jackson said. "Clean cut, legal edge, not an inch more, not an inch less." Neighbors gathered in lawn chairs by 9:00 a.m., holding coffee mugs and cell phones. One even brought donuts. It felt less like a demolition and more like a community theater production. By 11 a.m., half the garage was gone. Not destroyed, removed. Carefully, professionally, and undeniably within legal bounds. When the Monroe's SUV rolled up an hour later, Jackson was leaning against his porch railing, watching the remaining panels get loaded into a flatbed. The wife was the first out of the vehicle, face red with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" she screamed, sprinting toward him. "You vandalized our home." Jackson calmly handed her a printed copy of the injunction. "I removed the portion of your illegal structure encroaching on my land," he said, "as permitted by the court." "This is outrageous." "You'll regret this," she snapped, waving the paper in the air like it was on fire. The husband, for his part, said nothing. He just stared at the jagged edge of what used to be their dream garage. Neighbors whispered. One man actually applauded. That night, Jackson sat by the fire pit outside his cabin, wrapped in a fleece blanket, and sipping from a glass of red wine. He hadn't wanted a war. But if this was the front line they'd chosen, he wasn't backing down. The Monroes thought they were above the rules. Now, they were about to learn exactly what happens when you push someone who knows the law and has nothing to lose by enforcing it. By midweek, the storm had fully arrived. Not in the sky, but in the courtroom. The Monroes had filed a civil suit. Their claim? Willful destruction of property, emotional distress, and malicious interference with residential enjoyment. Jackson had read their complaint with a kind of clinical detachment only a seasoned attorney could master. His lawyer, Ellie Brower, a former judge with a reputation for surgical cross-examinations, merely smirked when she flipped through the stapled pages. "They're banking on noise," she said, tapping the folder. "They think if they scream loud enough, someone will mistake it for truth." Jackson nodded. "Let's give them silence and facts instead." The hearing was scheduled for a Monday. Small-town courthouse. A pale green building that smelled like furniture polish and tension. Jackson wore a gray suit, crisp, understated, unshaken. The Monroes arrived in matching Navy outfits, escorted by a young attorney from a big city firm who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The judge, a pragmatic woman named Keller, wasted no time. "Mr. Monroe," she said, peering over her reading glasses, "your claim suggests the defendant maliciously destroyed part of your property. Do you have documentation proving ownership of the disputed section?" The Monroe lawyer stood. "We were operating on the belief that the land in question was either common use or previously agreed upon by the prior owners." "That's not what I asked," Judge Keller interrupted. Do you have a current, legally recorded property survey confirming ownership? A beat of silence. Then, no, Your Honor. Keller turned to Ellie. Ms. Brower? Ellie rose slowly, her tone calm and exact. We've submitted 2 certified surveys. Both confirm Mr. Wells's property line and the extent of the encroachment. Additionally, we've included photographs, timestamps, correspondence requesting compliance, a formal stop work order issued by the county, and a signed affidavit from the county inspector affirming unauthorized construction. She paused, then added dryly, and video of the plaintiff ignoring said orders. Judge Keller leaned back in her chair. This is starting to sound less like malicious destruction and more like justified enforcement. Ellie smiled faintly. Exactly, Your Honor. The Monroe's lawyer looked flustered. The husband looked nervous. But it was the wife, her jaw clenched, her eyes glassy with fury, who stood without being asked. They humiliated us, she snapped. They turned the neighborhood against us. She pointed at Jackson, made a public display of tearing down our garage. It wasn't just about property lines. It was about revenge. Keller didn't blink. Mrs. Monroe, your feelings are noted, but law is not measured in emotional bruises. Do you deny building beyond your property line? The woman faltered, her confidence slipping. Her lawyer tried to tug her back down to the bench. Keller continued. Do you deny continuing construction after receiving a stop work order? More silence. In that case, the judge concluded, I see no merit in this lawsuit. It is dismissed with prejudice. Additionally, I'm referring this case to the county for review of permit violations and fines. Gavel. One sharp crack. The sound of a door slamming on the Monroe's narrative. As they left, Jackson caught a glimpse of the husband, head down, hands shoved in his pockets. No words, no threats. Just the heavy silence of a man who had realized too late that arrogance is expensive. But the wife? She turned as they reached the door, locked eyes with Jackson, her voice like venom. You haven't heard the last of us. Jackson didn't reply. He just watched them walk out into the cold. And for the first time since the garage had gone up, he felt the air shift. It wasn't over, but it was changing. The law was on his side. And now, so was the town. The Monroe lawsuit hadn't just failed. It had detonated, echoing through the lakeside community with the clarity of a bell. What was once whispered over fences now filled entire conversations. They lost. Jackson won. The law sided with him. And with that verdict came something even more valuable than vindication. Validation. Neighbors who had kept their heads down now began to look up. The retired couple, 2 doors down, stopped by Jackson's property with a tray of brownies and an apology. We didn't want to get involved, the woman said sheepishly. But we always knew you were right. Even the cranky guy with the pontoon boat, who once shushed kids for laughing too loud, nodded respectfully as he passed. For the first time in a year, Jackson felt like a member of the community, not a target within it. But the Monroes weren't done, not in spirit. With legal recourse denied and community support waning, they shifted tactics, quietly, pettier. It began with small acts of passive aggression. Loud parties at odd hours, motion-activated floodlights aimed directly at Jackson's bedroom window. Guests from out of town parking over the property line, always with a smirk and sorry, didn't see the markers. Bye. And then came the most childish move of all. A wooden sign hammered into the edge of their lawn that read, Welcome to the neighborhood. Some people take things too literally. Jackson didn't retaliate. He documented every instance, every light, every intrusion. He'd learned long ago that the moment you stoop to the tactics of the petty, you risk losing the moral high ground. Instead, he turned his attention to something more productive. The Lakeview Property Association had called an emergency meeting, not to punish the Monroes, but to finally confront what their presence had exposed. the lack of enforceable community guidelines, and how easy it had been for someone to exploit neighborly apathy. When Jackson entered the meeting hall, a repurposed boathouse with string lights and mismatched chairs, there was a hush, then slow, scattered applause. It wasn't for what he had done to the garage. It was for standing up when no one else had. The president of the association, a no-nonsense woman named Ruth Leary, stood and addressed the crowd. "We've all seen what happens when we let entitlement go unchecked," she said. "We've seen the damage it causes, not just to property lines, but to the fabric of who we are." Then she looked at Jackson. "I'd like to nominate Jackson Wells to chair our new Community Standards Committee. We need someone who knows the law, but more importantly, someone who gives a damn." Jackson stood slowly. The room was quiet. He wasn't a politician. He didn't crave power or prestige, but he did care. And for the first time in his life, he realized that sometimes protecting your home meant more than just defending your borders. It meant protecting the people around it, too. "I accept," he said. And just like that, the tide turned. Spring returned to the lake, the kind that wakes the trees in a hush of green and shakes winter from the docks. The water sparkled again. The old cabin smelled of cedar and coffee. And for the first time in years, Jackson Wells breathed without tension in his chest. The garage was gone. The lawsuit was closed. The Monroes? Gone too. They packed up quietly one gray morning in March. No goodbye, no public apology. Their departure wasn't announced, it was noticed. The moving truck came early, a high-end brand from out of town. A few neighbors watched from windows. No one waved. Jackson didn't celebrate. He stood on his porch, coffee in hand, and watched the SUV pull away. The house they tried to turn into a fortress, now hollow with silence. Later that week, the property listed for significantly less than they paid. Life at Willow Shore changed, subtly but surely. Kids returned to the water, their laughter once again blending with the call of loons. Lawn chairs lined the beach instead of citations. The lake was healing, and so were its people. But the true turning point came not from a legal document or committee meeting, but from a small, personal gesture. One Saturday, a boy, maybe 9 years old, approached Jackson on the dock. He was barefoot, carrying a fishing rod far too big for him. His father stood nearby, watching. "Mr. Wells?" the boy asked. Jackson turned. "Is it okay if I fish here for a little? I promise not to mess anything up." Jackson smiled. "This is a public dock, son. You don't need my permission." The boy nodded. "I just figured. You're the guy who protects stuff around here." Jackson chuckled. "Just protecting what's already yours." Later, as the boy reeled in his line and ran back to his father, Jackson heard the man say, "That's the guy I told you about. He stood up when it counted." It wasn't fame. It wasn't power. It was respect, earned the slow way. Ruth Leary stepped down at the end of that season. The community elected Jackson to take her place, president of the Lakeview Association. Reluctantly, he accepted, but on one condition: no more politics, just people. They rewrote the guidelines from scratch, not with a legal pad but with neighborly sense. No one-size-fits-all mandates, just fairness, clarity, transparency. And in the middle of that process, Jackson did something else. He planted a row of sugar maples along the restored property line, one every 10 feet. They weren't markers, they were memory. Living reminders that boundaries don't have to divide. They can define what matters. That summer, a local journalist came by to interview him. Not for a news story, but a piece about community resilience. When she asked, "What would you tell someone in your shoes, starting from where you were a year ago?" Jackson didn't hesitate. Respect yourself enough to protect your space. But remember, it's not the line on a map that matters most. It's how you walk it. And when she turned off the recorder and asked quietly if he had any regrets, Jackson looked out over the lake, where the sun melted into the horizon like a secret between old friends. "Only one," he said. "That I didn't speak up sooner."